I heard my father before I saw him. It was the same voice that used to call me in for dinner when I was a girl, steady and assured, the kind of voice that assumed the world would quietly fall into place around it. Now it carried across a crowded hall filled with uniforms and families, rising above the low murmur like something that claimed space without asking. "She dropped out of the Navy," he said to someone nearby. Not whispered, not softened with regret, said plainly, like a fact he had sealed long ago and never questioned. Couldn't handle it, but my boy now, he's a different story. For a brief moment, my body responded the way it always had, a tightness in my chest, a dull, familiar ache behind my ribs. Not anger. Anger burns fast and loud. This was something older, something worn smooth by time. It felt like weather you've lived through so often you stop checking the forecast. I stood at the back of the hall with my hands folded, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. Civilian clothes, no uniform, no insignia, no medals. To anyone glancing my way, I was just a woman in her late middle years who blended easily into any American crowd. Maybe a teacher, maybe a nurse, maybe someone's aunt who brought casseroles to church gatherings and listened more than she spoke. That was intentional. I had spent much of my adult life learning how to disappear when being seen served no purpose. I had learned how to remain still when people expected a reaction, how to keep my expression neutral when words were meant to pull something out of me. Silence had become its own kind of armor, quiet, disciplined, reliable. Up front, the stage was set with flags standing motionless in the conditioned air. Nearly every seat was filled. Families held printed programs in their laps like hymnals. The room carried that distinct scent of polished floors and pressed fabric. A mixture of duty and anticipation hung in the air. This kind of ceremony wasn't entertainment. It was something closer to sacred for the people who understood what it required. My brother was being honored that day. He had earned it without question. I was there for him. I was there because I had made a decision long ago that bitterness would not define the kind of sister I chose to be. The band quieted. A voice called the room to order. People straightened in their seats. A hush settled, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. And then, just before everything fully began, the general stepped into view. He moved with an unhurried steadiness that came from not needing to prove anything. His uniform was flawless, but it wasn't the fabric that drew attention. It was the calm authority he carried, the kind that comes from years of decisions that mattered. His eyes moved across the room the way experienced leaders observe, not out of curiosity but habit. First row, second row, parents, dignitaries, faces filled with pride, nerves, expectation. Then his gaze reached the back, reached me. Our eyes met. There was no hesitation in his expression, no searching, just recognition, quiet and certain, the kind that settles gently like a hand placed on your shoulder, as if to say, "I see you." He paused just slightly, so briefly that most wouldn't have noticed, but I noticed. I always had. Then, in a voice so calm it nearly blended into the silence, he spoke words I never expected to hear in a room shaped by my father's assumptions. "Rear Admiral, you're here." For a single heartbeat, the entire hall seemed to freeze. The air felt heavier, not because the words were loud, they weren't, but because they carried a weight that couldn't be dismissed. 200 SEALs rose to their feet in one seamless motion, not chaotic, not startled, precise, instinctive, like a single body responding to something it didn't need to be told. Chairs shifted in soft unison. Fabric moved. Boots aligned. The sound wasn't overwhelming, it was controlled. A unified wave of respect that passed through the room and left a stunned silence in its wake. I didn't react outwardly. I didn't smile. I didn't place a hand over my chest the way people do in films. I simply stood, slowly and deliberately. Returning respect matters, and I refused to turn that moment into something performative. Behind me, I felt my father go completely still. When I turned my head just slightly, I saw him frozen. The color had drained from his face. It wasn't the expression of a man who had been outmatched. It was the look of someone whose entire version of reality had just unraveled in front of witnesses. My mother sat beside him, eyes wide, her hand hovering near her mouth as if she had paused mid-breath. There was no anger in her face, only shock, and something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The realization that there had always been a space she never tried to fill. And my brother. He stood among the other candidates, his posture controlled, his expression composed, the way he had been trained. But his eyes searched the room. When they reached the back row, confusion flickered across his face, as if what he was seeing didn't match what he had been told. I knew that feeling. I didn't blame him. He had grown up hearing the same version of events. The difference was that he had never needed to question them. In my father's narrative, he had always been the hero. I had been the quiet footnote. For years, my father had been a respected figure in our community. He went to church every Sunday, sat in the same place, shook hands, spoke proudly about family values and service. He wasn't unkind. That was what made it complicated. He was certain. Certain in a way that left no room for questions, no room for complexity. When I was young, I followed instructions. I stayed quiet. I didn't seek attention. When given the choice between speaking and listening, I listened. My brother, on the other hand, filled every space effortlessly. Teachers praised him, coaches encouraged him. My father saw himself reflected there. Bold, visible, unmistakable. I joined the Navy for reasons I never fully explained, not because my family wouldn't understand, but because they never created space to ask. I didn't join for recognition. I joined because I wanted purpose, structure, a life defined by responsibility, not approval. My path didn't resemble my brother's. It didn't translate into easy stories over coffee after church. Over time, my silence became something my father found uncomfortable. He didn't like uncertainty, so instead of admitting he didn't understand, he filled the gaps with something simpler. She dropped out. It was easier to say that, easier than admitting he didn't understand my life, easier than acknowledging that some forms of service remain unseen by necessity, not by failure. The general held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod and continued as if nothing unusual had happened. He didn't explain, he didn't elaborate. That, too, was respect. In my world, you don't turn someone's life into a public explanation without permission. And just like that, the ceremony resumed. Flags stood still. Names were called. Words were spoken. But beneath it all, something had shifted, something quiet and undeniable. I had come to sit in the background, to watch my brother be recognized. I had not come to be seen. But truth doesn't ask what you came for. It arrives when it chooses. Calm, steady, unquestionable. The room continued moving forward, but inside me, time moved backward. Moments like that don't just affect the present, they reach into every year that led there. As the seals sat again and the ceremony carried on, I remained standing for just a second longer than necessary, not for attention, but because my legs suddenly felt the weight of everything I had carried in silence. Then I sat back down, hands folded once more, expression steady, as if my heart hadn't just been reminded how long it had lived inside other people's assumptions. My father didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The truth had already reached him.
People often assume that if you've spent enough time in uniform, you stop feeling. That isn't true. You simply learn to manage it. You set emotions aside when needed. You focus, you breathe, you hold your posture. And later, when the noise fades, you allow yourself to remember. I joined the Navy right after college, at a time when most people around me were choosing comfort, settling into predictable routines, staying close to home, building lives they could easily explain. I wasn't searching for comfort, I was searching for meaning.
I wanted a life where effort mattered, where discipline wasn't optional but expected. My father struggled with that decision. He appreciated tradition, but only when it aligned with his expectations. He admired service when it came with stories he could proudly repeat. My brother had already begun talking about the SEALs with admiration. My father embraced that easily. It was clear, dramatic, easy to understand. I was different. I made my decisions quietly, without announcement. The day I left for training, my father hugged me and said, "Don't make a fool of yourself," half in jest. My mother cried softly in the kitchen. My brother teased me, then held on to the hug longer than he intended. At officer candidate school, I learned something that would shape the rest of my life. Strength comes in many forms. Some of it is visible, measurable, loud, but much of it is not. I respected those who thrived in physical trials. I admired their resilience, but I also noticed something important. The Navy didn't run on noise. It ran on precision, planning, coordination. I was drawn to the work that supported everything else: logistics, strategy, intelligence, because I saw clearly that courage means little without preparation, without timing, without resources arriving exactly when they are needed. I trained in environments where the most honest answer was often, "We don't know yet," followed by the responsibility to find out. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of work my father would talk about proudly, but it was the kind that kept people alive. And over time, I learned something else. The more responsibility you carry, the less you talk about it. Phone calls home became difficult. I wanted to share, but I couldn't answer simple questions. Where are you? What are you doing? When will you be back? Sometimes I didn't even know myself, so I simplified everything. "I'm fine," I would tell my mother, "just busy." My father interpreted that as avoidance. He preferred clarity, defined narratives. Silence unsettled him, and the quieter I became, the more certain he grew that I had something to hide. When I missed Thanksgiving one year due to an unexpected assignment, his disappointment turned sharp. "Your brother would have found a way," he said. I didn't argue. We weren't the same. We didn't walk the same path. Comparing us was like comparing entirely different roles, both necessary, both demanding. Only one fit his definition of heroism. Missed moments accumulated quietly. Weddings, birthdays, holidays. Each absence carried weight. Each explanation stayed incomplete. Eventually, my father stopped asking questions. Instead, he started creating answers. I heard them later, in fragments, through others. A neighbor asking if I was all right after leaving the Navy. An aunt offering sympathy. "You tried." Even my brother once joked, "Dad says you couldn't handle it." I didn't correct him, not because it didn't matter, but because I understood how stories grow when left unchallenged, and because part of my discipline was knowing when silence served something greater. Still, there were nights I wondered what it might have felt like to simply be understood, not admired, not praised, just known. My career advanced steadily, quietly, without spectacle. Responsibilities increased, explanations decreased. I accepted roles that required discretion, where saying less was necessary. By the time my brother's journey towards becoming a SEAL became a source of pride in our family, my own path had moved into territory my father wouldn't have known how to describe, even if he had tried. So when I received the invitation to that ceremony and chose to attend quietly, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of understanding. The most meaningful work rarely announces itself. It simply appears when it matters. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a quiet weight. The sky was pale, the air still.
I arrived early, out of habit. Years of service had taught me to value empty spaces before they filled. The hall stood simple and functional. Inside, everything was in place. Flags aligned, chairs arranged with precision. I chose a seat near the back, slightly off-center. From there, I could see everything, without being seen. Families began to arrive. Soft voices, controlled excitement. Mothers held programs tightly. Fathers stood straighter than usual. Everyone understood the importance of the moment. My parents entered together. My father carried himself with confidence, greeting others easily. This was his environment, a place where pride could be expressed openly. "My son's a SEAL," he said proudly to someone nearby, handled everything they threw at him. Then, without hesitation, "My daughter tried the Navy once, dropped out, different temperament." The words landed the way they always had, familiar, predictable. I remained still. You cannot correct a story in a room that isn't listening, and this room wasn't listening for mine. The ceremony began. Commands were given, the room rose, the band played. My brother stood at the front, focused, composed. I felt nothing but respect. The general entered, his presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. He spoke with calm authority, about discipline, about commitment, about quiet perseverance. His gaze moved across the room, and when it reached me, it paused. Recognition again, unspoken. Then the ceremony continued. Names, achievements, applause, and under it all, the unseen work that made it possible. As the event neared its conclusion, the general's tone shifted slightly. "This unit represents the best of service, but service doesn't always look the same." A subtle change passed through the audience. He looked toward the back. "I would like to acknowledge a colleague in attendance." People glanced around. My father leaned forward slightly. The general met my eyes. "Rear Admiral, you're here." For a moment, silence held. Then, as one, 200 SEALs rose. Chairs moved in perfect unison. Fabric shifted. Boots aligned. The sound was controlled, disciplined, undeniable. I remained seated for a brief moment, not out of defiance, but out of grounding. Then I stood slowly, returning respect without ceremony. I met the general's gaze and nodded once. He nodded back just as simply. Behind me, I felt the air change. When I turned my head slightly, I saw my father frozen in place, his face drained of color. The story he had told for years had nowhere left to stand. The general resumed the ceremony without further comment, no explanation, no elaboration. The truth had been spoken. That was enough. The sound of chairs settling back into place came slowly, unevenly, as if the room needed a moment to remember how to breathe again. Protocol resumed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it. The ceremony moved forward, yet the air felt denser, charged with a realization no one had anticipated. I stood still for another second, feeling the weight of the moment settle fully into my body. Years of training had taught me that reactions matter less than restraint. I straightened my jacket, a small unconscious gesture, and then eased back into my seat near the rear wall. From there, I could see the stage clearly, and just as clearly the ripple the general's words had left behind. The men at the front stood straighter now, if that was even possible. They were professionals. They didn't whisper or look around, but awareness moved through them like a current. They understood hierarchy, they understood respect, and they understood exactly what had just been acknowledged. The general continued in a calm, even voice, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. That too was intentional. Authority doesn't need to linger on itself. It states what is true and moves on. My brother remained forward-facing, disciplined eyes locked ahead, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the subtle shift that betrayed confusion. He had trained himself to hold focus under stress, yet this was not the kind of stress he had prepared for. This was personal. This was family. I didn't look at him for long. That moment wasn't about us yet. Behind me, my father still hadn't moved. When I finally turned my head slightly, I saw him sitting rigidly, hands pressed flat against his thighs. His mouth was slightly open, as if words had been forming there and then abandoned him. His face, so often animated with certainty, was pale, stripped of its usual color and confidence. For the first time I could remember, my father looked unsure of what story he was standing in. I felt no satisfaction in that, no vindication. If anything, I felt a quiet heaviness. Truth, when it arrives without warning, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like loss, the loss of an illusion you didn't realize you were relying on. The ceremony concluded with the same dignity it had begun. Final words were spoken, commands given, applause followed, measured, respectful, earned. The men on stage were congratulated, recognized, photographed. Families rose and pressed forward, smiles breaking through the restraint that had held them in check for the last hour. I remained seated until the first wave passed. Old habits again. You don't rush into noise when you don't need to. Eventually, I stood and stepped aside, allowing others to move around me. A few officers approached, not with curiosity, but with acknowledgement, a nod, a brief handshake. "Ma'am," nothing more. They didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done. In our world, that kind of questioning would have been inappropriate. Recognition doesn't require explanation. The general passed by on his way down from the stage. He stopped briefly, just long enough to offer a quiet word. "I'm glad you could be here," he said. "So am I," I replied. That was all. We didn't need more. Across the room, my brother finally turned. His eyes found mine, and for a moment the distance between us, years of different paths, different understandings, felt suddenly visible. He excused himself from a group of fellow candidates and made his way toward me, stopping a few feet away. "Is it true?" he asked softly. There was no accusation in his voice, just honest confusion. "Yes," I said. He exhaled slowly, as if setting something heavy down.
"I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. He nodded, absorbing that. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I considered him carefully. He wasn't asking, as my father would have, defensively or with expectation. He was asking because his world had just shifted and he needed to understand where the ground was. "Because my work wasn't something I could explain," I said, and after a while it didn't feel necessary to try. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you're here." "So am I," I repeated. He hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me, brief, firm, controlled. Not a dramatic gesture, but a sincere one. "You deserve to be seen," he said quietly. I felt my throat tighten just slightly. "This wasn't about that," I said. "Today is yours." He nodded still. We parted without ceremony. I moved toward the exit before my father could gather himself enough to approach me. That conversation didn't belong in a room full of witnesses and cameras. Some reckonings require walls and quiet. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm but subdued, casting long shadows across the pavement. The parking lot buzzed with life, families laughing, phones raised for photos, voices overlapping in relief and pride, life moving forward unchanged on the surface. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, steady despite the undercurrent of emotions still moving through me. I looked at my reflection in the windshield, older than the woman who first raised her hand and took the oath, marked by years of decisions made without applause. I thought about my father again, about the story he had told for years because it made his world simpler, and about how simplicity often comes at the cost of truth. I hadn't planned to be acknowledged that day. I hadn't come to correct anyone. I had come to witness my brother's achievement and leave quietly. But sometimes the truth doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes it steps forward, spoken by someone else at exactly the moment it needs to be heard. And once it's spoken, there is no unhearing it. The crowd thinned slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell of what had just occurred. Conversations resumed in softer tones. Laughter sounded cautious, measured, as though people were unsure how much of it belonged in a room that had witnessed something unscripted and deeply human. I moved deliberately, offering space to those who needed it. Years of service had taught me how to read rooms, not just for threats or logistics, but for emotion. Who was ready to speak? Who needed silence? Who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives? A few men approached me quietly, not in groups, one at a time. A nod, a handshake, a simple, respectful ma'am. Nothing else. They didn't ask questions, they didn't linger, they understood that recognition doesn't require conversation. In their restraint, I felt more seen than I ever had through applause. My brother found me again near the edge of the hall, where the noise faded into a manageable hum. Up close, I could see the exhaustion beneath his composure, the kind that settles into bone after years of relentless training. His eyes, however, were clear. "I didn't know," he said again, softer this time, as if the words needed to land gently. "I never expected you to," I replied. He frowned slightly. "I should have asked." "Maybe," I said, but we were both busy becoming who we needed to be. He nodded, accepting that without argument. "Dad's shaken," he added, glancing across the room. I followed his gaze. My father stood near a cluster of people he'd been speaking with earlier. Now he wasn't speaking at all. He stared down at the program in his hands, as if it might explain something to him if he looked long enough. The man who once filled rooms with certainty now seemed unsure where to place his weight. "I'll talk to him later," I said. My brother hesitated, then said, "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He wasn't proud of my rank or my recognition. He was proud because he had seen something about me that day he hadn't understood before. My restraint, my patience, my willingness to let truth stand on its own. "Thank you," I said. We hugged again briefly, then parted, each pulled in different directions by family and obligation. I stepped outside before the ceremony hall emptied completely. The fresh air felt grounding, cool against my face. The sky had shifted toward afternoon sunlight, slanting across the parking lot in long golden lines. Families gathered near cars, children tugging at sleeves, cameras flashing. Pride lived here too, but now it felt quieter, more reflective. I leaned against my car for a moment, breathing slowly. I wasn't overwhelmed, but I was aware of something settling into place. An emotional ledger finally balancing itself, not through confrontation, not through explanation, through acknowledgement. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my mother. "Are you okay?" I typed back, "Yes, I'll call later." I didn't add more. She would understand. She always had, even when she didn't fully know how. That evening, I checked into my hotel and ordered a simple dinner. I ate by the window, watching traffic move steadily along the road. The day replayed itself in fragments. The general's voice, the sound of chairs rising, my father's pale face, my brother's quiet hug. Each memory felt vivid but oddly calm, as if my mind were filing them carefully instead of reliving them. Later, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring once more than usual before answering, not to punish him, just to give myself a breath. "I didn't know," he said as soon as I picked up. His voice was unsteady, stripped of its usual firmness. "I know," I replied. "I told people things," he continued, "things I shouldn't have." There was a pause, thick with words he wasn't yet ready to speak. "I never corrected you," I said gently, "but that doesn't mean it didn't matter." He exhaled, long and slow. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked," I thought, but I didn't say it yet. "Because my work required silence," I said instead. "And because after a while, I didn't think you wanted to hear a complicated answer." Another pause, then quietly, "I was wrong." The admission wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And in that moment, it mattered more than anything he could have said earlier in my life. "We'll talk," he added, "when you're ready." "Yes," I said, "we will." After the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed, phone resting in my hand.
I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's events and everything to do with the release of something long held. Accountability, when it comes without cruelty, can feel like rest. That night's sleep came easily. The next morning, as I prepared to leave town, I passed the ceremony hall once more. It stood quiet now, empty, waiting for the next moment that would fill it with meaning. I realized then that what had happened there wasn't the climax of my story. It was the hinge. The applause had faded, the recognition had passed. What remained was something more durable, the beginning of honesty, the possibility of reconciliation, and the understanding that truth doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it simply stands and waits to be acknowledged. We didn't talk again for several days, not because either of us was avoiding the other, but because some conversations need distance before they can be honest. I had learned that in my work. Decisions made too quickly, without space to breathe, often carried unseen consequences. This was no different. When my father finally asked if I could come by the house, he didn't frame it as a demand or an expectation. He asked carefully, almost formally, as if unsure what ground he was standing on. "Would you come over for dinner?" he said. "Just us. Your mother will be there, but I'd like to talk." "I can," I replied. The drive back felt longer than usual. Familiar roads stretched out in front of me, lined with trees I'd known since childhood. Nothing about the town had remained changed much. The grocery store still sat on the same corner. The church steeple still caught the afternoon light at the same angle. It struck me how places can remain constant while the people inside them quietly drift apart, then sometimes find their way back. My parents' house looked exactly as it always had. Neat lawn, porch light on, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. My father's habit again. Better to see what's coming. When I stepped inside, the smell of cooking wrapped around me, warm and familiar. My mother greeted me with a gentle hug, lingering just a second longer than usual. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her eyes told me she'd been carrying her own questions for years. My father stood near the kitchen table, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked older than he had at the ceremony, or maybe he just looked less armored. We sat down to eat. The table was set simply, nothing fancy, just the kind of meal that had sustained our family for decades. Conversation stayed on safe ground at first. Traffic, weather, my brother's plans. My mother spoke about a neighbor's new grandchild. My father listened more than he talked. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down.
"I've been thinking," he said. I waited. "I kept telling myself that if something mattered, you would have said something," he continued. "That silence meant there was nothing to say." I took a breath. "Silence can mean many things," I replied. "Sometimes it means trust. Sometimes it means boundaries." He nodded slowly. "I didn't see that. I saw quiet and thought it meant failure." "That's because you were uncomfortable not knowing," I said, not unkindly. "So you filled the space." He looked down at his hands. I did. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He squeezed it, then looked back up at me. "I told people you dropped out," he said. I said it like it was fact. "Yes," I said. "I was wrong," he said again, more firmly this time. "And I'm sorry." The apology didn't come with excuses or justifications. It wasn't wrapped in pride. It was simple, and because of that, it landed. "I'm not angry," I told him, "but it mattered. Words travel farther than we think." He swallowed. "I see that now." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer felt heavy. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for, not defensively, not with expectation, but with genuine curiosity. "What did you do?" he asked. "I don't need details, I just want to understand." I considered how to answer. Years ago, I might have tried to explain everything, to justify myself. Now, I chose carefully. "I served in ways that weren't meant to be seen," I said. "I helped make sure other people could do their jobs safely. I made decisions that didn't come with applause." He nodded slowly. "That sounds important." "It was," I said, "and it required silence."
He leaned back in his chair, absorbing that. I thought being proud meant talking, he said. Turns out it might mean listening. That's a good lesson, I said gently, at any age. He gave a small, rueful smile. I wish I'd learned it sooner. So do I replied, and for the first time saying it didn't hurt, didn't. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Old photo albums sat on the coffee table, their spines worn from years of being pulled down and put back. My father opened one at random, flipping through pictures of childhood birthdays, holidays, school events. There were gaps, years where I appeared only once or twice, always smiling politely, always leaving early. I didn't ask then either, he said, almost to himself. No, I agreed. But I could ask now, he said. Yes, I replied. He looked up at me. I'm proud of you, he said, not because of rank, because you stayed yourself. Something in my chest loosened at that. Recognition doesn't always come from being seen publicly. Sometimes it comes from being understood privately. When it was time to leave, my father walked me to the door. The evening air was cool, the porch light casting a familiar glow across the steps. I won't tell that story anymore, he said, about you quitting. I know, I replied. And if people ask, he pressed. Tell them I served, I said. That's enough. He nodded. That's enough. As I drove away, I realized something important. Reconciliation isn't about rewriting the past, it's about agreeing to tell the truth moving forward. And sometimes that's the most meaningful victory of all. Retirement didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, papers, signed responsibilities handed over, goodbyes spoken quietly in hallways where no one lingered too long. The Navy doesn't celebrate endings the way civilians imagine. There are no curtain calls. You step aside and the work continues, as it should. In the weeks after my final day, I found myself waking early out of habit. The house was quiet, sunlight just beginning to stretch across the kitchen floor. I brewed coffee and sat at the table, listening to the small sounds of a life no longer ruled by schedules and alerts. For the first time in decades, there was space to reflect without checking a watch. That was when I understood what the ceremony and everything that followed had truly given me. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't vindication, it was clarity. My father adjusted slowly but sincerely. When neighbors asked about me now, he didn't reach for labels or shortcuts. He said, "My daughter served for many years." Sometimes he added, in ways we didn't always understand. He said it without embarrassment, without prideful boasting, just respect. That mattered more than any public moment ever could. One afternoon, we sat together on his porch, watching cars pass and leaves drift across the lawn. He stirred his coffee and said almost casually, "You know, I used to think the loudest people were the strongest." I waited. "Now I think the strongest ones are the ones who don't need to be loud at all." I smiled, not because the statement was profound, but because it was learned. My brother visited not long after. He looked different out of uniform, lighter somehow. We talked about ordinary things, plans, work, the strange adjustment back to civilian rhythms. Before he left, he paused and said, "I've been telling some of the younger guys something." "What's that?" I asked. "That not all heroes stand at the front," he said. "Some stand behind the map." That, too, mattered. As time passed, I began speaking occasionally to small groups, retirees, veterans, families, young officers, spouses. Not to tell my story in detail, but to explain something simple, that service doesn't always announce itself, that some careers are built on silence because silence keeps people safe, that worth isn't measured by how often your name is spoken, but by how steady you are when no one is watching. People nodded, some looked relieved, others thoughtful. Many, I realized, had lived their own quiet versions of being misunderstood. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's one I wish more families understood sooner. Don't speak for someone whose path you never asked about. Silence isn't failure. Often it's discipline. Often it's trust. Often it's a choice made in service of something larger than comfort or approval. And if you're the one who stayed quiet, who carried responsibility without recognition, I hope you hear this clearly. Your life doesn't need witnesses to be valid. Truth has a way of standing up on its own, even years later, even when you aren't asking it to. The day my father introduced me simply as his daughter, no rank, no correction, no story attached, I felt something settle into place. Not because the past had changed, but because it no longer needed defending. Some victories arrive without cheering, some reconciliations happen late, and some lessons take a lifetime to learn, but they are no less real for coming quietly. If this story gave you pause, if it reminded you of someone you misunderstood, or of a chapter of your own life that went unseen, I invite you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Maybe share this story with someone who might need it. And if you'd like to hear more stories grounded in dignity, truth, and the strength of quiet lives, consider staying with us and subscribing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reflecting.